Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Culture for All Digital Festival, Week 6. We started this festival in January 2021, and after almost a year long celebration, we are concluding it in October and November. The festival, supported by Tata Technologies, has been put together to celebrate the release of a first of its kind interactive, multilingual, open access digital cultural map by Sahapedia, map.sahapedia.org. You can explore our neighborhoods in a whole new way through this new interactive platform. So do browse when you have time. Coming back to today's session, Indian Maharajas of the princely states are often depicted as self-indulgent and consumed by lust and luxury. They have been attributed with no role in the making of contemporary India. Author Manu S. Pillai steps into this scenario and with his brilliantly researched book False Allies, India's Maharajas in the age of Ravi Verma breaks this stereotype. In today's conversation, we will learn what role these Maharajas played in shaping India's political history and how they remained false allies of the British. Before we begin, let me introduce you to the speakers. Author and historian Manu S. Pillai is known for his debut non-fiction work, The Ivory Throne, for which he won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. After the success of his first book, there was no stopping for him. His other works include Rebel Sultans, The Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin, and False Allies. Subhashini Dinesh is an accomplished journalist, academic, and author. She is currently working with the Tata Group as a communications professional. Welcome both. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Subhashini, you can take this conversation forward.
Thank you, Saili. Very good evening to you, Manu, too. And good evening to all those who are watching this program. It gives me a lot of pleasure to talk to Manu Pillai. And I read his work, the latest False Allies, and I think it's a fascinating journey for me. It's a learning curve for me as well. I learned a lot. And I think what stood out really stark was the last, the sign-off line, where he mentions that, I've just written it down. The gist of it is that it's not unchanging relics of some ancient past and out of place in modern India's evolution. They were part of the process themselves. We are talking about the princely states. He was talking about the princely states. They are part of the process themselves, even if ultimately they lost out. Their states were not old-fashioned islands where time stood still and society decayed. They had their own politics and internal dynamics, which are also part of this country's tale. What a fantastic sign-off line, Manu. With this, I would like to kick off this conversation with you. And it's an immense pleasure for me to talk to you about this. And it's a journey I think you need to take us all in this beautiful journey of pre-colonial and post-colonial states that we are talking about here. And there were very interesting anecdotal references also where you mentioned that why only India? Why is it that the royalty in India is always targeted as being very opulent and very rich in its approach? Nobody talks about the West. Would you like to elaborate on that? It's a very interesting comparison and a very interesting introspection for all of us, because even Indians are, we ourselves talk about the opulence and say what kind of grandeur they have, but then nobody talks about the West.
I mean, that's the thing. And thank you, by the way, for the wonderful introduction to the book, for reading out that final bit, as well as for your kind words. I'm glad you enjoyed the book. And thank you to Sahapedia for hosting this event. That's the one thing, right? It's when somebody has some kind of a narrative or some kind of a stereotype around any given subject, one of the first things you learn when you build on this business of critical thinking or analyzing something, whether as a historian or any other subject, is to ask certain questions. Why is this narrative there? What is this narrative? What purpose is it serving? Why does this narrative exist in this particular form, in this particular way, and why is it continued for so long? And when you ask those questions, you start seeing holes in the narrative, you start seeing politics behind the narrative, and you start comprehending the thing far better. And I make that case about, comparing it to European royalty, for example, simply as an illustrative thing, which is that even today, the British still have a constitutional head of state. Even now, they spend a lot of money on maintaining this huge aura, the uniforms. It's on the face of it, it's anachronistic. On the face of it, it doesn't belong. And yet, clearly, the British see value in it. And yet, the same British, when they were in India, they would often lampoon on the one hand the Rajas. On the other hand, they would equally insist that the Rajas should look that way. The famous story of Sayajirao Gaikwad of Baroda showing up at the Delhi Darbar of 1911. The British were very upset that he didn't come in all his regalia, that he wasn't wearing all his expensive diamonds, that he wasn't wearing the decorations that they'd given him. Essentially, that he refused to look like some kind of tropical exhibit. The fact that he came looking ordinary, looking businesslike, looking normal was not appreciated. So on the one hand, they would laugh at the Maharaja, saying, you're effeminate, you're just obsessed with jewelry, you're just these colorful types decked like dancing girls. On the other hand, they would also insist that the Rajas look like dancing girls in quotes, which is where you start uncovering the politics, that the British wanted the Rajas to represent some kind of stereotype. All the same, they needed the stereotype to lampoon the Rajas. It was a form of psychological as well as narrative control. It made the Rajas, it made Indians who were ruling over parts of India look like idiots, and thereby justified the British and their effort to look more masculine, to look more businesslike, to look more efficient, to look more capable. But as the book argues, many of these Rajas had strategies to fight this back. It could range from how they posed in paintings, it could range from how they dressed, to actually how they governed their states, what were the institutions they cultivated and constructed in their states. It was a whole range of things of strategies that they had to fight back these British stereotypes. But ultimately, yes, much of the world revolves around narrative battles. To this day, go on Twitter on any given day and you'll see that the battle is very much about narratives. And if that is true today, it was true then as well. And my argument in the book is not that the princely states were utopia, that they were some kind of wonderful place, all the Rajas were wonderful people. No, they had their flaws, it had its problems. All I'm arguing is that we should not succumb to a colonial narrative, and we should treat princely India more seriously, because it controlled 40% of India's landmass, which means if we talk of modern Indian history, we can't just talk of the 60% that was British ruled India. We must talk of the 40% that was Indian ruled India.
Absolutely. I completely agree with this hypocrisy and also the psychological game that the colonial discourse basically was. You're right, you're absolutely right about how they wanted the Rajas to dress up like clowns and present themselves. And maybe that was also the image that they want to project in the international platform, that look, that's why we are here. We are here for a reason. We are here to rule and govern this land of these Rajas who dress up like clowns. But at the same time, they're very disappointed because their presence in the Darbar, wearing normal clothes, as we call it, would actually be a defeating narrative for them. So it's absolutely, it makes a lot of...
It was the whole idea that, this was an exotic country. Either we were just like spiritually exotic, we were a land of palaces and treasure and elephants, or we were a land of poverty and famine and terrible things. There was no normalcy, Being normal was some kind of Western quality. Everything in India either had to be comical or extremely grand, spiritual or extremely backward. There was nothing normal about, again, in quotes, the natives. Whereas princely states, you often find that because they were constantly attacked with this barrage of stereotypes and all kinds of narrative sort of strategies to keep them under control, they did necessarily have to devise a response to it. And I begin the book, for example, with that painting of the Travancore prince, a boy of only 16 years old.
Tricycle.
Yes, and he's on this very Western contraption, dressed in Western clothes. And there's another painting which I haven't included in the book where he's with his brother, and they're both standing in front of a globe, and in his hand he has a book which talks about America, and his brother's pointing out America to him on the globe. They're signaling something through these paintings. They're signaling their modernity. They're signaling the fact that we are equal to the British, we're equal to you in claims to having modern minds and modern outlook. Of course, they're playing on terms set by the British. The very fact that he has to wear Western clothes to look modern suggests that he's bought into the game. He's bought into the rules. He can't change the rules. He has to play by the rules. That's what colonialism is. It was a lopsided field. Even if you had to win on the terms of the colonizer, and you couldn't just reset the terms. Of course, where this changes is Gandhi and the later period from the 1930s, 20s and 30s, where the rules itself are upset. Gandhiji comes in and changes the rules completely. But as the book argues, still Gandhiji comes. There's a slightly different game going on. And the princely states are very much part of that conversation and that dynamic.
Actually, in this its context, it's an interesting anecdote which I remember of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was denied entry into a meeting hall hosted by the Europeans, by the British, because he was wearing Indian clothes.
Yeah.
And so he had to go back, change
and come back.
to a tie, and then let the tie go, dip his tie into the soup, and said, "Why don't you eat? This is for you." You know, that's a kind of anecdote. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you have to. They had to, the narrative was such that they had to, even the attire had to be conforming to those standards of modernity. In fact, you mentioned even in the paintings, so many of our Rajas had to show the spine of the book when they're posing, because they had to inform the world that they were readers, and they were
readers of English books, specifically English books, Western classics, the Iliad, things like that. The example that I often give is of the Pudukkottai Raja's painting by Ravi Varma, because in the background you have the temple gopurams, which signals continuity with the past, continuity with tradition, his Hindu heritage, all of that. And yet you have his hand on the Iliad, because he's representing that, look, I'm capable of also engaging with everything the West treasures as classical and valuable. So it was very much a game of narratives. It was very much a game of projection. And that particular king in Pudukkottai was a fairly weak ruler. But in art, he was able to signal some kind of political personality. And it was important. The important thing for a historian is not necessarily to decide whether it was good or bad, whether he was a loser or whether he was not. The important thing is something about this equation is interesting. If it's interesting, it's importance of study. That's the important word there. It's not good or bad. Is it interesting, and does it matter as a historical process? And I think it does.
It does. Because it conveys a lot more than, and I think the book False Allies, as well as the kind of visual imagery through words that you have mentioned, you have portrayed, it opens up a fascinating account of each of these princely states and how they have engaged with democratic ideals, with medicine, with surgery. I mean, you're talking about Uttaram Tirunal, who actually, went into European, English medicine and surgery. And also, I think that was also, you're talking about this clandestine attraction to Christianity that you've mentioned. And I think it was during the period of 1814 to 1860 that's a period of Uttaram Tirunal. And I think somewhere there is a kind of, do you think, I mean, I'm just asking this to you because it reminds me of a movement in Bengal, the Derosians, as well as the Rajaram Mohan Roy's movement, a Bengal Renaissance, where there was a parallel kind of a narrative there, a discourse on Westernization, imbibing of Western ideas, philosophy, and also, in fact, the young Bengal, they went into meat eating and to prove that beef eating, to prove that they are not bound by these societal norms. Now, do you see any kind of a connection there? I mean, because it just struck me.
There is a connection. And also, there's a larger point to be made. Firstly, that even the fact that we are surprised that these men were capable of studying anatomy, capable of studying science, capable of doing medicine, we've in some way internalized the British idea that they were supposed to be traditional in quotes, and therefore they're doing this is somehow very, very unusual. But the very idea that traditional is some kind of rock, that it's some kind of like solid thing, and for 800 years we haven't changed, is not true. Indians were dynamic people as well. We were also negotiating change constantly. So the funny thing is the British came and they decided, oh, Indians, you are traditional, we are modern. And therefore, every time a Raja or a Hindu king, for example, went and did an anatomy experiment or something, it was a hoo-ha would be made around it, because of course it was unusual. Kings didn't go around doing, studies like that normally. But it took away the dynamism and it made it look like an exception rather than a human, like a normal thing that people would do. Now, the example really is that even in the early 19th century, a lot of the Orientalists and the British intellectuals in India, which were often military officers, government officers, they also moonlighted as scholars and writers. They would be collecting exotica, ancient India, ancient things. They were obsessed with some classical ancient past. And the Indians they were looking at were traditional Indians. But what were Indians doing in the same time? We were trying to acquire Western science. We were acquiring Western ice makers, electric machines, doing anatomy studies. At least the Indians who had access were trying to do this.
Right.
There's this wonderful line, wonderful from my perspective, where Lord Macaulay visits the Maharaja of Mysore, who's also in this book, Krishnaraja Vadiyar III.
Yes.
And I don't think the quote is in the book, but he says that, oh, his house his drawing room resembles the home of a vulgar Cockney cheesemonger because it's full of all these random European things and, this and that. But Macaulay could look at that with contempt because he was looking with his English taste and saying this is all very garbled and doesn't make sense. But the Mysore Maharaja, look at it from his perspective. He's collecting these objects as a part of his curiosity.
Absolutely.
He's collecting Western furniture, Western art. He's also collecting a lot of Hindu, manuscripts and so on. That's another thing. It's a part of his dynamism. He's able to do both. So the important thing is to look at these princes as dynamic individuals who were not traditional in some stereotypical sense. Yes, they respected tradition. Yes, they were custodians of tradition. They felt they had to protect the culture they had inherited. All the same, they did not think culture was some kind of unchanging item. It was something that also adapted. It was something that also invited change.
Exactly.
They wanted to do it on their terms. The difference isn't that. The difference is that they did not believe in mindless westernization. So even Uttam Tirunal, who you mentioned, famously sat for a miniature painter in Western clothes.
Western clothes,
But that did not mean that he gave up his identity as Padmanabha Dasa, with the Padmanabha Swami temple. That also mattered. So his being interested in reading Christian scripture, his picking up the English language. You see a lot of missionaries saying, oh, this is a symptom or a proof that he's about to convert to Christianity. Actually, no. For him, it's just his intellectual mind. He just wants to study more and attract more information, learn more. He wants to read what Christianity is all about. But all the same, he's also a protector of Travancore in that, and a culture that he's custodian of. The important thing here to see is not see this as an anomaly, but to see a Raja or a political figure, somebody capable of negotiating this and trying to negotiate it on their terms. Through the book, this is essentially what I'm trying to show about all these Rajas. They're all political figures, they're all political actors trying to be in control of a situation where the politics is lopsided. They know the field is not a level playing field. They know it's tilted against them, and their effort constantly is to preserve as well as take control of the situation. That is why I call them interesting figures and figures worth studying, as opposed to seeing them as museum exhibits or just people who sat on elephants and did nothing all day long. That's not true. They were in fact very dynamic and active people.
Yeah, and actually, it's very interesting because you have actually seen through the lens of Ravi Verma's paintings, and Kerala as some kind of is a matrix to this entire. It's sort of a backdrop to this entire narrative of all the princely states that you have mentioned, whether it's Baroda or it is Pudukkottai or so. What I'm asking, I'm very interested. Why? How did this idea come to you to sort of pick this and then sort of paint the narrative of the Indian princess through the lens of Ravi Verma's eyes and also other paintings? It's a very interesting way of looking at, because it's a mind. I mean, I think it just like the colonial psychological game that was happening at. I think this is sort of an eye opener for a lot of us. For us Indians, the postmodern Indian, it's a fantastic piece of postmodern literature because it sort of gives I think those who are born after 1990, maybe 2000, I think it's a must read for all of them to understand that, not to dismiss these off as, because I think the narrative is so strong, the colonial narrative, just like the Brahminical narrative is so strong. It's just the same, it's like a Brahminical narrative is so strong. Like, for example, they say that how they think Indians, most of them are vegetarians. And it's a narrative which was built over time, with educated Brahmins. But I think the same kind of a narrative which the colonial British sort of built around the country. So how did you think of this idea? It was a fantastic idea.
Well, Travancore had to be there, partly because I've been working on Travancore for over a decade now. My first book was on Travancore. Even after that, I've continued working on it. My PhD involves more research on Travancore. So I'm still sort of unearthing a lot, because you have to be master of one subject, right? I mean, that you have to be absolutely sure. And for me, in many ways, that's Kerala and Travancore, that modern period in that particular region. So Travancore, of course, had to be there. But more importantly, leaving aside my personal interest in Travancore, the important thing also is that in the mid-19th century, Travancore was among the earliest princely states to realize that to survive in the colonial era, to survive and prevent British interference on a daily basis, to keep the colonial state at bay, yes, the rules were set by the colonial state, but Travancore was among the first states to realize that if we ace those rules, if we play this game even better than the British, we can hold our own. We have to adjust, we have to make certain changes. It may not always be savory, but doing it means we can survive and we can actually beat the British at their own very rigged game of progress, again in quotes. And that for me was important because it's a good beginning space, because if you look at all the other princely states, chronologically as well, they in many ways follow what's happening in Travancore. Even the Diwan, like somebody like Sir T. Madhav Rao, who helps Travancore modernize for a good 12 years in a 14-year Diwanship, but properly for a full 12-year period. He then moves to Indore and helps the Indore Maharaja.
Yes.
When he goes there, because he's been such a success in Travancore in keeping the British at bay, in resisting colonial pressures and imperial influence, when he goes to Indore, the British resident quite candidly puts on the record that he's been brought by the Maharaja to fight with the British, because they realize that this one trained man can turn around the princely state and actually help the princely ruler preserve his turf without further encroachments from the British. So Madhav Rao goes to Indore. Then he ends up in Baroda and then reshapes Baroda itself.
Right.
So Travancore in many ways is the nursery where a lot of these dynamics are born, at least where it's very clearly visible to us from the 1850s onwards. So that was one reason why it decided to give Travancore that kind of influence. Ravi Varma for another reason, which is that firstly, he was the ultimate princely insider. He was born in a princely state. His ancestors were Rajas in Malabar several centuries ago. He was related to royalty. His own granddaughters became the Maharanis of Travancore. My first book was about that. And the fact that he was a very posh sort of society painter. He would move around, he would get these commissions from not only princes but also grandees in British ruled India. So he was this bridge in that time, in that late 19th century period, where he knows Gokhale, where he knows Tilak in Western Indian British ruled politics, but he also knows the Maharaja of Baroda. He also knows the Maharaja of Mysore. He also knows the Rajput ruler of Udaipur. So he was this wonderful. I don't want to write a general textbook on the princely states where I take far too many and just sort of write a dull text.
Yeah.
I wanted to go into some detail, into some of the layers for individual princely states, take them really as case studies. But all the same, I didn't want to do a book which would be each chapter on a princely state without any connection.
Exactly.
Ravi Varma was useful because on the one hand, he allows you, even it's a very slender, tenuous thread, but even so, he allows one continuous sort of thread to run through the book. The fact that he's always present, even if in the background, he's there throughout the book. So for the reader, there's one thread that's running through the book. And the fact that because he's served and worked in multiple princely states, I did not have to arbitrarily choose states. I could just follow him. Whichever state he landed up in, I would go dispassionately study that state and write up my research based on that. So it was not as though, otherwise I may be biased to choose states only like Travancore. I may be biased to choose a certain kind of state. But by following him, I had a Travancore in Kerala, a Kallar-ruled, robber caste-ruled Pudukkottai in Tamil Nadu, highly advanced industrialized Mysore in Karnataka, Baroda in Gujarat, but ruled by Maharashtrian royals. Right. Rajputana, where you have Udaipur, with its own, politics of tribals and the British and all of that. Right. So it was a very eclectic set of states. He worked in these states. My only regret is that I should have included Hyderabad because that was the final state he went in. He didn't get a commission there. It was a failure for him. The Nizam did not hire him to do paintings, which was my excuse for not including Hyderabad. But really, including Hyderabad would have made the book even longer. It's already 550 pages. I didn't want to write another 700-page book. That's the only reason Hyderabad was left out. But I came very close to including this one, the biggest and the most important Muslim princely state in India. But I had to unfortunately hold my horses and prevent my temptation from taking over.
That could be a fodder for your next book, because I'm looking forward to your insight into the Nizam, because I think many of us are not familiar so much about, we are only, I'm sure the generation also, today's generation, we've studied history, yes, we read history, a lot of history books out of interest. But there needs to be some kind of, the narrative, a story-like narrative also, where people will, them will gain a lot of understanding of what Hyderabad. I mean, Hyderabad, they only think about Nizam, they think about food. There's nothing. There's so much more to that.
Yeah. Also, I mean, the core political structure. In fact, I make that point in the introduction. We often think of a princely state, and as I said, we think of a Raja arbitrarily sitting on a throne, doing what he wants, nobody to control him, spending time in the harem half the time, the rest of the time oppressing the peasants, and that's the sum totality of a Raja or a Nizam or a Nawab. But in reality, obviously, politics and life is more complicated than it is made to appear. In the Nizam's case, his ancestors come here only in the 18th century. From a position of political structure and simply understanding topics like state formation in India, how modern entities were born, the Samasthan states, which were tributaries to Hyderabad, which survived till 1949 as well. Some of those go back to the Kakatiya period, 13th century. So although the Nizam is new, his vassals are very old. So already you're seeing political structures and a dynasty and a political system that goes back all the way to the 13th century, has survived the Delhi Sultanate, the Qutub Shahs, the Mughals, and the Nizam, and survives till 1949. That alone is a fascinating slice of history. Then the whole question, like in many other princely states, in Travancore, it was foreign Brahmins versus local Nayars. In Hyderabad, it was Mulkis versus non-Mulkis, because the Hyderabad Nizams would import North Indian Muslims to come and serve in Hyderabad, and the local Muslims are very angry about that. Add to this another layer, which is a large Hindu population ruled over by a Muslim elite, and the contradictions and the politics born of that. Finally, add the invasion of Hyderabad in the late 1940s after independence, which of course we often call police action, but it was a full-fledged military invasion. Really, air power was used. Official reports say that tens of thousands of people died in the aftermath of the police action. That alone was a huge event. We often focus on partition and the violence of partition. We don't focus on the violence that took place in Hyderabad. The report that was written after that was actually concealed. Officially, it's still not been released. Why? So looking at that one princely state ruled by a Muslim over majority Hindus, interesting dynamics, state formation where you have these old vassal states with a new ruler on top, Mulki, non-Mulki, which tells you about identity in India. All of these things can be understood by looking at just one princely state. And many of these things still affect our politics, caste related, communal related, who's an insider, who belongs to the nation, who doesn't belong to the nation. These debates happen in a new terminology today, but they've also existed in the past. And looking at these princely states is a way to make some sense of it from a new light, instead of looking at it as purely new problems that we are dealing with today in the 21st century. Actually, no. These problems also have a genealogy. We just haven't looked at them in the places where we need to look.
Absolutely. In fact, it's interesting because you've taken care of Travancore. Like you said, it's a model. But there has been so much happening in Travancore in the sense of modernization. Like you said, the Diwan, who sort of did a lot of civic changes, made a lot of reforms, brought in a lot of civic reforms, and he's also the same Diwan has also made a lot of changes in other princely states as well. So basically, like you said, the kings were not just sitting on thrones watching the dancers. They were actually doing a lot of civic work, planting trees, irrigation, building roads, etc. But nobody is really talking about those. It's only
to be fair, I was asked recently in a newspaper interview that can we even call this nationalism, because ultimately they were serving themselves. That is true. I mean, ultimately and to call it selfish or self-centered is wrong, for the simple reason that they saw their states as legitimate political entities, and they saw their thrones as legitimate sources and founts of power because it had come down so many generations, whatever. And frankly, a lot of Indians respected that. If you look at all the early nationalists, they actually respected most of the Rajas. The bigger Rajas were often icons and inspirations for nationalists in British rule India, down to Gandhiji's time. So this idea that they were self-centered and they were only building roads, etc., to preserve their own power, that's true of people in power even today.
Exactly.
I mean, we saw something happen in the news yesterday, which it is about elections. It is about winning and keeping power.
Exactly.
So anybody in power, there's always this sort of trade-off between preserving your position and, of course, doing things for good. And if it's true for today's politicians, it's true for political figures yesterday also. It's a plain fact of politics. But the important thing to note is that the princely states are interesting because they would get these divans, and they knew that the only way they were aware that we cannot become anachronisms. We can't live in some kind of feudal past while the world around us changes. Therefore, they would bring in these English-speaking, Western-educated men to build roads, to help trade develop, to build canals, to help agriculture prosper. They wanted all that done, not just to preserve their power, but also to give their state the economic vitality to survive changing periods and changing times, to survive pressures from the British. It was all about that.
In fact, it's very interesting you mentioned this moral weight of power. I've sort of noted it down. And you're talking about how the reforms were forms of defense mechanism, right? where migration, we're talking about migration, where if we don't give them work here, they'll go somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? You find in the chapter on Mysore, for example, you assume Mysore Raja has full power. He doesn't have full power. He firstly has subjects. Some of them are, a good chunk of them are Lingayats who've always had issues with the Vadiyar royal family.
Right.
The other chunk are
Vocaligas.
Vocaligas who are also capable of pressing the court and rebelling against royal power. So rebellion of that sort always keeps the king on his toes. He has to be very cautious about it. All the same, the king also has to preserve his idea of kingship, which means he's giving Brahmins a lot of money, he's building temples, that is happening. So he wants to have that side of kingship, but he also wants to make sure his peasants are happy, because otherwise they'll push him off the throne. Then his power is also checked by his bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is manned by Brahmins, and the Brahmins have their own tussle and balance of power with the king. On top of this, you have the pressure from the British.
Right.
So a Raja is a politician because he has to deal with external pressure, internal pressure, factions at court, the harem. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Women in the palace can be a powerful force in their own right.
Right.
They can also make and undo kings. The women had that kind of power, even if they were in the shadows behind Parda. Yes. Even if they were in the Parda, precisely because the Parda was hidden from the gaze of the Westerner and the white man, they were able to fight from there using weapons that the British would not even know what they were.
Yes, right.
So the Raja had to negotiate all of this, and it involved politics. In the Pudukkottai chapter, and this is one of the things, the Diwan was very upset that the Ranis were surrounded by Devdasis, and Devdasis were seen as disreputable women, dancing girls. Why should they come into the palace? How backward. But in reality, look at it from the position of the Ranis. They live in Parda. They can't go into court. They can't go into the street.
Right.
Who are these Devdasis? They're dancing girls. They're dancing in the temple. So they hear what is happening in the temple. So they're dancing at the weddings and the receptions and the baby naming ceremonies of important noblemen, important courtiers. They're listening to what's happening over there.
Right.
They know what is happening in the court. They know what is happening in influential places, and they know what's happening in the streets. They are a network of information that comes to the Ranis. So although the Ranis are hidden behind Parda in a palace, the Ranis are perfectly astute and they're aware of what is happening in the court and the world outside.
Network.
And the Devdasis are their channel with the outside world.
Absolutely.
So when an Englishman or even a Brahmin Diwan comes and says backward, Devdasi is equal to bad, kick them all out, you're essentially cutting the Rani's political influence.
Absolutely.
It's not so, on the face of it, it's about cleaning up the palace. It's about moral reform. It's about keeping the bad influences away from the palace. But in reality, what is it about? It's about politics, and it's about access to information and access to power. That's why I say, you just scratch beneath the surface of a princely state, and the stories and the dynamics that come out are so fascinating, whether it's gender, politics, religion, caste, whatever it is. And this is precisely why, a small state like Pudukkottai, 1,200 square miles in Tamil Nadu, even the royal family, we assume all these kings were Kshatriya kings. Not really. Pudukkottai were Kallars, which is technically the British call them a criminal
thieves,
tribe.
thieves.
Yeah, the caste of robbers and thieves. Maharaja of Indore is a Dhangar, which is a shepherd caste.
Right.
Somebody else is a Maratha. Somebody else is a Rajput. All of these families and their histories also tell us a lot about how so-called marginalized castes could also access power.
Absolutely.
How people who were not from the usual template of proper Kshatriya kings could also govern and could also be kings. All of this breaks down a lot of stereotypes we have about our past, which is precisely why in such a rich and diverse country, to not look at these things is the travesty. We should really go out and pursue these stories.
Yeah, and in fact, all the democratic values that we're talking about, the democracy, there was a lot of discourse on democracy. And also, I think this whole thing of why can't we also have democratic power within the princely states? And there was also this parallel narrative that was going on, right? Like even Dadabhai Naoroji, for example, that thread is also very interesting, where you're talking about things about self-governance and how we can actually wield that power, and we don't need someone external to come. And it can be possible within the princely states, within the same space, that they can govern, they have their influence, and they can sort of kick off this whole idea of self-governance could be done. So,
in fact, a lot of the early nationalists, whether you look at Dadabhai Naoroji, Gokhale, M.G. Ranade, look at their writings, look at M.G. Ranade's selected writings are published, for example. You realize that what they essentially say is, British ruled India. Yes, the British are extracting it. They're exploiting it. We can't really control it. We can fight it, but the British really are in control.
Right.
Indian ruled India. They're at a disadvantage in the sense that the British are still more powerful, but yet a Raja still governs his people. He still commands their respect. He still levies taxes. He makes his own laws. The British may add pressure or they may not, but they're an external irritant. They're not directly affecting the lives of Indians. So for a lot of nationalists, this great desire and the great design really was that if the princely states, if we as nationalists help the princely states, if we go there as divans like Dadabhai Nauroji did, if we go into these princely states, help the Rajas reform their administrations, build modern institutions, build roads, build canals, do all of that, those enclaves in India will start thriving. Suddenly the
even
people
including legal codes.
yes,
legal
everything
codes
will become better for the people
reform
there.
taxes, etc.
Yes. So the better life becomes for people in princely India. Without even saying it, you can show that the British rule in British ruled India is terrible, because in British ruled India, the same things are not happening. The other advantage that the princely states had was that in British ruled India, a lot of the money that the government got by revenue, a good chunk of it had to be put aside for defense, for maintaining armies. The princes often had treaties with the British, which is, so the Travancore Maharaja, for example, committed to some 8 lakh rupees in the early 19th century. At that time, it was a huge portion of his revenue. But as time passed, what essentially happened is that, I don't see you, Subhashini, suddenly, but what essentially happened is that that amount became very small. As time passed, that tribute became a relatively small figure of the state revenue, and larger portions of the revenue were at the Raja's command. So when you have a revenue of say 20 lakhs, 8 lakhs is a lot, which is in the early 19th century. But when you come to the late 19th century and say you have revenues of 80 lakhs, 8 lakhs is not that much. So the princely states did not spend much on defense, with the result that all that money was saved and it could be used for building roads, for building institutions, and for other things. I think we've lost Subhashini. Okay, I don't know what's happening. Saili, if there are any questions so far, I think we can take them while Subhashini gets back her feed. Okay, I can see a few questions. Who were the other Maharajas whose stories, equally fascinating, don't find a place in the book? Well, I would name Tukojirao Holkar, because he was a fascinating figure, ruled with an iron hand, was not, one can't say that he was some kind of a democrat, very much an autocrat, but an autocrat who was efficient, kept the British at bay, and the British saw it from the 1857 rebellion, when he sort of, almost tried to play a double game and support the rebels rather than the British, down till the 1870s, where he was advising other Maharajas on how to face off British pressures. He was seen as very disloyal for that. So he was one interesting figure, Tukojirao Holkar II. Similarly, Ganga Singh of Bikaner. Ganga Singh of Bikaner was also raised under British tutelage, supposed to be very loyal, ended up playing a very important role in the First World War. And more importantly, he was this man who in the 1910s would give the British these lectures on bringing self-government to India, giving British-ruled Indian territories giving Indians in British-ruled territories greater control over their destinies. And in fact, he spoke of cooperation between the princes and the democratic element in British-ruled India, giving the British a huge nightmare. The last thing they wanted was princely prestige and honor and power and wealth, combining with nationalists in British-ruled India and essentially creating a huge problem for them. So that was that. I will take the. Hi, Subhashini,
I'm terribly sorry. There was a power failure here.
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
I plugged the gap by taking one of these audience questions, which is in the chat box. So that's
thanks, Manu. I'm really sorry.
Not
I don't know. The power situation in Bangalore is so erratic, and it just it took time for me to log back.
That's
fine. Sorry. We left.
No, I finished that answer, so you can now resume your questions.
No, I sort of lost the thread. Yeah, so we were talking about how they were, even Madhav Rao you're talking about, who built roads, established courts, etc. And he said British ought to trust the native talent. And that's the kind of a strong statement he made, and which was also made by a few other divans and leaders.
Madhav Rao was, I think, in many ways a diplomat. I mean, there's a wonderful biography coming out by Rahul Sagar. I hope he publishes it next year. It's going to be a very interesting book. Madhav Rao was, many people don't know, one of the first Indians to formulate a draft constitution because, for Indian ruled India, because he said, if the princely states are to survive, obviously the Rajas will have to give they'll have to share their power with their people. They'll have to, understand that democracy is the trend of the future, sort of quickly get onto that rather than resisting that. So he was a man who had that kind of vision. All the same, he was a diplomat. He didn't want to pick too many bones with the British. He didn't want to pick too many fights all at once. So he was something of a diplomat. But you often find that a lot of these Diwans, they would begin life in British Indian service. So, but all of them discovered that even though they studied English, even though they studied the British classics that the Westerners respected, no matter how well they spouted Shakespeare and wonderful dialogues from the old texts that the British valued, ultimately they would hit a glass ceiling in British India. Ultimately, they would always have a white man as their boss, and they would never be in complete control. They were very aware of that. And that is why whenever men like him, Sheshaya Shastri, V. Ramayangar, people like this would switch from British ruled territories to princely service, become Diwans in princely India, they would firstly have unprecedented power. They would no longer have a white man sitting on their head in the same way. They had great control over the resources of the state, and then they would try to modernize it, and they would often be able to resist the British in a completely new tone. Sheshaya Shastri was a clerk in the British service, moved up that way, essentially was a glorified secretary in the British service. But then he moves to Travancore service and becomes this extremely strong defender of Travancore's autonomy, of its cultural practices, of its policies, tries to prevent the British from interfering in its judicial practices, for example, which shows that all you have to do is lift the same Indian from British territory and British service and put him in a princely rule, in a princely setting, and his tone completely changes. And you start seeing this with many of these Diwans. And the Diwans, in fact, deserve a book of their own in some ways, because Madhav Rao, of course, as I said, works in 3 states, changes those 3 states. His son becomes Diwan of Mysore. Madhav Rao's great ambition was to also become Diwan of Mysore. Ultimately, his son becomes a Diwan of Mysore. Because English-speaking Indians were so few in number, often they came out of the same school. So Madhav Rao was succeeded by Sheshaya Shastri, who was a classmate. Sheshaya Shastri had a successor called V. Ramayangar, who was a classmate. They often came out of the same institutions. One of the Diwans of Mysore also came from the same school, but a different batch. So the overlaps between these men are just very, very fascinating.
Right.
And
is it also C.P. Ramaswamy?
CP was much later. CP was from a much later period. He was active in the 30s and 40s.
So this whole culture of, they had this parallel bureaucratic setup. I mean, they almost like it was a layer of bureaucracy, which the princely states had to sort of manage the affairs of the kingdom, so to speak. So, but there was a lot of resistance, obviously, from the colonial rule, because they were interfering. It was obviously jarring to them because it was interfering with their bureaucratic.
The one thing the British hated was Indians using Western legal language, Western institutions for their purposes. So long as the British were guiding the guiding force, so long as the British were tailoring everything, it was fine. The moment Indians sort of owned these institutions, applied it on their own terms in their own territories, that was a big no-no, because then, firstly, the whole claim that the British were somehow more sophisticated than the natives, that breaks down. When the natives have a bureaucracy that's even more efficient than the one in the British India, your whole locus standi to be in India sort of struggles to exist. The other thing was, in fact, they would often hate Rajas who made a virtue out of good governance, because it was a form not directly of attacking the British, but of indirectly saying that, look, we're actually even better than you. Why don't you get out and let us rule? Because we know how to rule. We've owned your modern institutions and we'll make it our own. Of course, there was resistance from below also, because one of the things we find that whether it was in Baroda under Madhav Rao, whether it was in Rajputana, modern institutions also meant dismantling older institutions. So the way the tribal community in Rajputana, the Bhils, interacted with the Maharanas of Mewar, that was upset when the Maharanas' new infrastructure started coming in. The way peasants interacted with the state, that changed often when the infrastructure changed. So often you'd have a system where you had a local feudal lord, and then now the local feudal lord is replaced by an official from the capital who comes to collect taxes. Naturally, the feudal lord is losing power, and the feudal lord has an incentive to try and create trouble in that system. In some princely states, force was used, and the system was perfectly and very strongly entrenched. Travancore is an example. In some princely states like Mysore, as James Manner argues, the Rajas played a double game. They said, okay, fine, we will not interfere with local infrastructure or local power balances. But in urban areas, in certain areas like industrialization, factory building, things like that, we'll focus on that and we'll leave rural governance to the rural elites. We won't interfere too much in that. So each princely state would find a different way to negotiate that very complicated business
Yeah.
of, on the one hand, beating the British, but on the other hand, also not upsetting their own people. It was a very mixed and complex game that was underway in all these states.
It's a very interesting thing which you just mentioned about the rural and urban, because I think there's a mention where because of the industrialization, it was both rural but urban, and the rural were ruled. There was also a caste dynamics here, where you had the urban, the rural had Vokalingas and Lingayats, and a lot of the funds were being sort of pumped into high energy, high investment, and that's where they suffered. The finances suffered, and that's where the kind of friction also happened, right?
That, in fact, in many ways happens even in today's politics, right?
Exactly.
So after independence, for example, Nehru, some people criticize Nehru's grand industrial projects, the dams, the IITs, all of that, saying that, oh, he should have actually invested in schools rather than these grand flashy projects.
Right.
But the important thing is he was also making a point to the world, and he also wanted to train an elite that would understand these things and be able to, local engineers rather than importing engineers from elsewhere. He wanted to create an infrastructure for that. Same with today's politicians. Having a bullet train is often a prestige element. It may not be necessary. It may not. The people may just need ordinary trains to work better and to run on time. But the bullet train is also a means for the state and for the Indian government internationally to make some kind of a grand point. It's also
a kind of a statement.
So with Mysore, what's interesting, and this again tells you the internal dynamics of a princely state and the different things the Raja had to manage. On the one hand, the Mysore Maharajas realized, look, building schools, canals, cliche. Lots of states are doing it. Travancore is doing it. Shesha Shastri is doing it. Pudukkottai, Baroda is doing it. What will make us distinct? What will make us unique? Industrialization. So we're going to start investing in heavy industries, iron and steel works. Gold mines are already there. Huge dam works. Things like that. So they decided that industrialization is going to become the holy grail of Mysore. And there was this technocratic elite that was very invested in this, because they were aware that not only was it about endowing Mysore with this new infrastructure, it was also about making Mysore this kind of iconic space for Indians at large. It was also about proving a point to the British that your argument that natives don't know technology, natives are not good at science, these things can be punctured by proving that natives can pull off big projects. So these projects often did not make profits. For the longest time, for decades and decades, you would pump money in and get nothing back. But they knew that these white elephants were worth having because it was making a larger point. As the Mysore authorities and people in Mysore themselves said, this was not about profit. This was not about the government. When the government created an iron and steel works in Bhadravati, I think, it was not about making money. It was about making a point. But as you said, making that point always means that ultimately your resources are limited. So when in making this grand point, you end up neglecting something else. So slowly people in rural Mysore started realizing that why is our technocratic elite so obsessed with this? When we still don't have canals, when we still don't have enough schools, when we still don't have local health centers, what's the point of building a huge dam? So that conversation is also happening simultaneously. Add on to it a layer. Much of the technocratic elite are Brahmins. The people in rural areas are not Brahmins. So this economic divide also gets a caste-based divide, and Mysore politics sort of ends up revolving around that. So as I said, the layers and layers and layers that exist, there's no one way to read a princely state. In many ways,
there are fascinating layers.
Things are happening at the same time. It can be very contradictory and seemingly confusing, but ultimately it all makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also somewhere like that's a reflection of what's happening today as well. Like you said, whether it's a political discourse or the bureaucratic discourse or the peasant discourse or the industrial discourse.
I mean, yesterday's thing is a good example, right? Again, a lot of people like these laws are very important for our economy as a whole to move forward. But if you don't bring the people who are affected on board, which is the farmers, for example, you can't really bridge that, right? So there's clearly some kind of a divide there. So even in our time, there is a divide between what the elite sees, and rightly so perhaps, as an important thing for the economy as a whole, versus the people who are actually living that thing. So if it happens even in our time with all our information and all our IT and all our internet and all that, and all our communication, and imagine what it was. And imagine what it was then 100 years ago. So it's not, these patterns are not unusual. These patterns existed even in princely India, just on a smaller scale than we see today.
Yeah. So moving on, Manu, this is another interesting narrative that you have, you're woven around Shayaji Rao and his conflict with the Raj. I mean, it's great that, in fact, affinity for intellectuals of Pune you're talking about, who the British regarded as secessionists. And one of them is also Jyotirao Phule. it comes out very clearly that how that narrative in Maharashtra, that intellectual thread that sort of sprung in Maharashtra and sort of wove around. If you could just talk about it for our viewers, because they'll be interested to understand.
So, Maharashtra is essentially where not only did a kind of extreme version of nationalism emerge, so there was a gentlemanly version that
Yes.
as the old cliche goes, emerged in Bengal, but the more firebrand Tilak style version emerged
Yes.
in Maharashtra. Remember, Maharashtra is also where the RSS emerged. So Maharashtra is clearly an interesting space historically in terms of political dynamics. Now, the important thing between Baroda and Maharashtra is, although Baroda is in Gujarat, the ruler is a Maratha. So he's very interested in what's happening in what we would call Bombay Presidency. And as I said, this early overlap between the nationalists and the princes is fascinating, because what you find is a Raja coming out and even meeting these nationalists. In a way, it is a stamp of endorsement. In a way, the governor of Bombay coming and meeting the nationalists is one thing. But when a Raja who's respected by local people, who's respected as a traditional authority, comes and meets a Phule, comes and meets a Ranade, comes and meets a Tilak, it endorses what those people are trying to do in British rule India. Similarly, when the British try to interfere in Baroda, the Raja can sort of wink at his nationalist friends in Bombay Presidency, and they will, in their newspapers, remember in the late 19th century, almost all the nationalists wrote extensively in the local newspapers, not only in English, but also in local Marathi and other Indian languages. So they would then take up the princely state's cause and become defenders of the princely state in British ruled India. So it was this interesting equation between the two, where the Raja would support the nationalists in Bombay Presidency and the intellectuals and their causes to annoy the British. And they in turn would support the Raja also to annoy the British. They had a common enemy, so they worked together. That was a natural kind of thing. In Sayajirao Rao's case, and in the case of many of these Rajas, eventually, of course, they would fund the Congress party. The Congress would become the big vehicle that attracted a lot of their resources. But they also funded educational institutions. So I studied at Fergusson College. It was run by the Deccan Education Society. It attracted a lot of revolutionaries in the early 1900s. And that was also the period when the Rajas were putting a lot of money into the Deccan Education Foundation. So look at it how the British see the Rajas are paying money to a foundation or an educational society that runs an institution that has very clear anti-British, students and their politics over there. So there's a clear link there. Similarly, a lot of the Rajas were funding local and even international Indian associations. So Indore Maharaja gives 25,000 rupees in the 1870s, a lot of money by standards at that time, to Nauroji's East India Association. And what does the East India Association do? It talks about India, it talks about India's rights and claims and India's future right under the nose of the Queen in London. Similarly, they're giving money to the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. The Pune Sarvajanik Sabha is another of these organizations. Again, very Brahmin, very elite, but all the same, it's creating a ruckus and becoming a pain in the side of the British. So there's this fascinating overlap between what's happening with the nationalists and what's happening with the princes. And as I argue in the book, the two really fall out only in the 1930s. It goes back to your earlier point about democratic experiments. Ultimately, democratic experiments in princely India had a ceiling, in the sense that no Raja would allow his powers to be completely controlled by a democratically elected element. Even an ultra-modern, ultra-enlightened Mysore, ultimately the Raja was willing in the 1940s, I think, to concede 2 seats on his cabinet to elected members, but not the majority, because the Raja ultimately wanted to retain control in his hand as an autocrat. So there was that problem. In British ruled India by the 1930s, the British realized which way the wind was blowing. They realized there was an expiry date to the Raj, and they started conceding more and more power to the Congress party and to local politicians. So there were provincial elections in 1937. A lot of the ministries, education, health, etc., were handed over to Indians as opposed to the British. Of course, defense and finance would remain with the British, but a lot of the other ministries were handed over to the British. So suddenly people in princely India started looking at British India and saying, actually, British ruled India now has more democracy than princely India. Earlier, it was the other way around. It was people in British ruled India looking at the better and the bigger princely states and looking at them in admiration and awe. Now that role was reversed. And as I said, the Rajas proved very hesitant to give up their autocratic powers. And with the coming of the Second World War, with the coming of new dynamics, the Rajas realized that, we're fading into history. And they became more and more repressive. People on the ground started agitating for rights. In many ways, because the Rajas built schools, because the Rajas created an infrastructure that would allow people to become politically aware, in some ways they wrote their own obituary, because the people then naturally started, showing political aspirations. They said, look, we want to control our destinies. We respect the Raja, but the Raja must concede power to us and our representatives. That finally in the 30s and 40s became very sour. The Congress and the Rajas became enemies. After a long 50 years of being friends, they actually, in the final 20 years, became enemies. And that's the bad reputation a lot of the princes get is largely from that phase, as opposed to the earlier phase when the princes and the Congress were friends.
And in a way, I think the later years, the kind of the Rajas, the paint, the brush that they painted them with, which is a darker hue,
Yes.
sort of completely defaced their earlier phase.
Yes, yes.
Somewhere.
And that has local, post-colonial politics also to it,
Yeah.
which is, by Indira Gandhi's time with the big socialist turn.
Exactly.
Suddenly the Rajas started looking like anachronisms. They look like these feudal lords. I begin the book with that quote by Indira Gandhi where she says, "Go ask your Rajas how many roads they built, how many canals they built." Yeah, if you look at the sum total of their contributions, it is zero. In reality, it is not zero. It's actually a great, much more than zero. But even so, that was the narrative that came up. The other thing is that it's almost human, right? Which is that once the Rajas lost power, many of their descendants, even today, cling to the remnants of it with even greater vigor.
Yes.
So the thing is, in some ways, they do look like anachronisms because you still have coronation ceremonies, you still have like this hoo-ha that is done. You start looking feudal, and it was therefore easy to also brand them feudal after independence because many of the descendants, having lost power, became more and more sort of insecure about what they still had left. So I often joke that the princes who actually ruled pre-independence had less of an ego than a lot of princely descendants today, because today they only have the palaces and the paintings and that kind of relics of the past that are there, as opposed to actual power. Their ancestors who had actual power need not have been so insecure. It's again an interesting thing, but yes, post-colonial India and the way we look at Rajas is largely colored by what happened in the 30s and 40s and what happened thereafter with the socialist turn.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why, in fact, we've also mentioned, it's absolutely the last point, which we thought I should mention here for everybody to know that this is something which is completely, it was an eye-opener for me, where, going back to Travancore, talking about relationships and open relationships and polyandry. I mean, your gender discourse that you're talking about, I mean, that also sort of slowly faded over time because the Victorian prudish, sort of approach and sort of completely sheathed everything into put it in the back burner. And I think these are interesting issues. Like apart from what you just mentioned about what they have done has been completely cloaked by this new narrative that has emerged during the colonial 30s and 40s. And also the abolition of privy purses, that they needed a reason to do that. And that's why they said, go ask your kings how many roads were built, etc. What was the infrastructure that was created? So that is completely obliterated or maybe faded completely what they have done. And I think that's something which comes across very clearly.
That's the thing, right? I'll repeat that I'm not arguing that all the Rajas were wonderful people or that they were all successes, they were all great. Actually, no. Sayajirao Gaikwad was followed by a grandson who was a pretty bad individual, and he sort of ditched his wife and took off with his grandfather had famously declared monogamy a state rule in Baroda. The grandson said, "Oh, look, it doesn't apply to the king; it applies to the people, not to the king," and went on to have a polygamous sort of arrangement. So, but even so, because Sayajirao had created the infrastructure for the state to run well, it didn't matter if the Raja was bad. The state already had a system that allowed the people not to suffer under such a bad Raja. So I'm not saying all the Rajas were great, not at all. But yes, I think there is more to them. We can't really isolate the bad eggs in a basket and say that, oh, the entire basket sucks. In reality, no, the bad eggs are bad eggs, and bad eggs existed on the British side also. If you make fun of the Rajas for having lots of women in their lives, for example, you can also say that of Queen Victoria's son. He had, tumbled from one married woman's bed to the other, and that somehow is not judged. He's still seen as this great monarch of the British and the king emperor and all that. Somehow when an Indian Raja does it, it's considered bad. A lot of this is a human quirk. Human beings do these things. It's not such an unusual thing. Lord Curzon, who had such a stiff upper lip and this perfectly erect spine, who gave the princes lots of lectures, he had a youth where he was also tumbling about with married women, where he was also playing lawn tennis stark naked. So if you make fun of a Raja for having certain eccentricities, I'm sorry, the Viceroy also had human eccentricities. That is just human behavior. To make that representative and to paint an entire class of political actors with a brush that is full of cliches, stereotype, exoticism, etc., that is a political thing. That is a political narrative that is woven. That is not good history. And I think the point of good history is to unravel and sort of pull back those political layers and look at all the other layers that exist simultaneously.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the eccentricities did not exist. All I'm saying is that was not the sum total of what was happening in princely India. We must look at these things more maturely. And if you look at it maturely, you're able to identify the quirky, the weird, the fun, the crazy, but you're also able to look at the serious, the detailed, the layered, and the complex. And that is what gives you a more richer understanding of history itself.
And the evolved understanding of politics, democracy, reforms, social reforms, as well as economic reforms. I think with this, I would just like to tell our readers, I think we've sort of come to the end of this discussion almost. I just don't feel like ending the discussion. I would just love to continue talking about it because each of your chapters just unravels.
I'm curious, which one was your favorite? I ask this to everybody who's read the book these days.
I think your narrative about Pudukottai was an absolute eye-opener for me.
Fascinating.
It was fascinating. But having said that, I think Travancore unraveled a lot of interesting, detailed, at least it unraveled a lot of myths, basically.
And that's the other reason Ravi Verma was useful, because, I wanted to highlight gender politics, for example. And there are two Ranis, and the Rani and the Raja's wife that I used to build those contrasts. One is Ravi Verma's sister, the other is his patron's wife.
Right.
And again, it wasn't that I wanted to do another chapter on Travancore with the gender thing. It's just that because he was the thread through the book and his own relatives had this interesting thing going on, it made sense to include that.
But what I just love, why I said, Pudukottai, of course, for me, it was an eye-opener, the Scullers and how the thieves, how they sort of got their piece of land and how they built their empire, or that little princely empire that they called themselves in Pudukottai. But what fascinated me about Travancore was also the women, the matrilineal society, and not just the matrilineal society, but also the women, the way they dressed. I mean, Lakshmi Bai and her exposure, and in fact, how she draped herself in a skirt and a dupatta to attend these social dues. And also, I think one of the women, I don't recollect her name, posing with a sleeveless, blouse, which is completely unheard of during the time that we are talking about. And I think that discourse, the gender, the economic, as well as the cultural and the educational discourse, which are very neatly layered and neatly woven. That is my favorite. I think that really fascinated me a lot because, and what is fascinating also, which I would like everybody to understand, is how you have completely woven the entire discourse of the princely states, not just from south, but you've also gone north and gone till Mewar. Through the eyes of Ravi Verma. I mean, that is something,
in fact, there's an audience question saying that somehow the North was ignored by Ravi Verma because, he never went and painted there. It's true. If you look at I don't want to arbitrarily choose, but if I were to look at the map, essentially you have a C-shaped thing, which is that Mysore, Pudukottai, and Travancore essentially cover much of South India, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. So 3 big states. Baroda, because it's close to Maharashtra, Royal Maratha, so that covers Western India, and then it goes up to Rajputana. So it really is a kind of C-shaped thing on the map, rather than. I wish I could have included something in North India, but as Kavita in the audience question says, Ravi Verma did not. He did go to Gwalior, for example, but he never got a commission to do a portrait for the Raja. Otherwise, for all you know, Gwalior would also have been included. And Gwalior has fascinating characters as well, including women rulers like Baizabai. Amazing figure.
Absolutely.
And Gwalior's history has this fascinating bit about opium cultivation and this huge conflict with the British, where the British want a complete monopoly on opium because of their China connection and their China trade, and they don't want that to be undercut by princely opium coming out of elsewhere. And how for the Scindias of Gwalior, that opium was extremely important because now, not because they wanted money. Now look at the thing, right? Again, I'm going on with a long answer, but opium trade essentially meant liquid cash in hand at the end of a trading cycle. Liquid cash was important for maintaining a standing army of 40,000 people. Absolutely. And because Gwalior had that standing army of 40,000 people, it was one of the last princely states. It was only in the 1840s that the British really managed to get it under their thumb. Till then, because the Gwalior Maharaja had tens of thousands of troops at his command, the British could not bully the Gwalior Raja. And then when British resident came to Baizabai's court, she was the queen of Gwalior, she treated him as a complete non-entity because she had the troops and the arms to still retain that kind of autonomy. So,
Right.
that's just one North Indian state. Maybe in some other book at some point, I'll do something on the states
Yes.
I could not cover. But
Yes.
yeah, I think.
But it's important that you sort of covered a lot of South history in the South, because largely we find Southern history ignored in a big. I'm not talking about I don't want to bring the North-South divide here, but I think largely when you really look at textbooks, a very little small portion of your textbook is devoted to the South Indian history, and essentially it's only about the Cholas, Cheras, Pandyas, Rashtrakutas, and with a smattering of the Nizam, etc., or the Tipu Sultan, Hyder Ali, Carnatic Wars and stuff. But I think this book is a must read, I must say, for everybody, and not just this book. I mean, I would really want everybody to read modern history as you have written, and I'm sure there are many others who have written, because it's important for us to understand the how we can unravel the layers that have been completely sealed by the kind of the colonial discourse that we have been exposed to so far. And it's important that scholars like you are working on this, and I really want to thank you for this kind of insight into the kind of history that you have thrown light on. And I think it's important. I request everybody to just go and just read this book and understand, and this will sort of open a gateway to read Manu's other books as well, because you have written about there's another interesting the Ivory Throne, or and I would also, I'm sure my next book is going to be Ivory Throne and Where the Gods Dwell, where I think you're talking about.
Yes, I have one essay on the temple. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Is that a collection of essays, or
it's a collection with 12 other writers? So each person's taken. So there's, I think, I've written on Padmanabh Swami. Someone's covered Pashupatinath in Nepal. There's something from Sri Lanka, something in Pakistan. So it's actually South Asia, but a lot of temples. 13 temples from South Asia.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is a fascinating account, and I come to the end of this discussion.
And thank you for the wonderful questions. And despite your little power outage, I'm glad you came back and we could resume the conversation.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Manu, for your fantastic insights, and for sort of throwing so much of information, giving me so much of insight, and not just me, to everybody else. Sort of makes us all charged to sort of go back and read, and not just follow what others are saying, and read. And
well, fingers crossed. I hope people watching will buy the book and enjoy the book as well.
I would like all of you to just buy False Allies, please. And it's a brilliant book, and it's a must-have. It's a collector's item. Please don't go for pirated versions. Go for the book, for the printed version. There's nothing more gratifying than picking up a book and turning the pages. And it is a page turner. I can assure you. You've got fantastic research done, and you've devoted almost 150, I think 170 pages devoted to the research that that has gone into it. It's a lot of research, and I wish you all the very best for your next book, whatever you plan. And for many more books to come. I mean, it's going to be a treat for all of us. And looking forward to more such books from you.
Very kind of you. Thank you. I think Saili, we can hand it back to Saili now. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you both for joining us, and definitely now Manu's book will be next on my reading list. Yes. So thank you both for joining, and let us remind you before we sign off to go and please do browse www.map.sahapedia.org. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.